Sinking fund management for strata and commercial buildings. What we'll be looking at will be the sinking fund and its main components, and the history of sinking funds and the requirements of that in the industry around Australia, to give you a good idea on how these sinking funds come together and how they come about, I suppose. So this will give you a good insight on how these are prepared and what people look at when preparing one of these sinking funds. Alright, so when you own a unit, there's usually two funds that most people look at. One is your administration fund, which is your day-to-day expenditure, and also the sinking fund, what we'll be looking at, which is your big ticket items. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so what is a sinking fund? So a sinking fund is a detailed and comprehensive estimate of the council's corporate sinking fund expenditure for the next 10 years. That includes estimating of repainting of common property and the buildings are owned by the body corporate. So if you look at maintaining your vehicle and servicing your car, you've got to do the same to the common property area and maintain that as if it was back in its original state. So that's the whole point of that sinking fund, and that from there. So there's a few components that are in the sinking fund what we need to look at. So we need to provide for the necessary and reasonable expenditure from the sinking fund for that financial year, reserve a proportional amount to meet their anticipated expenditure over the next 9 years, and also you've got to take into account the anticipated expenditure of the capital nature as well as the period replacement of these items of a major capital nature, and also other capital that should be reasonably met in that time period. So it gets a little bit confusing sometimes to work out what needs to go in and what doesn't, but we can look at that a little bit later on. Alright, so what we'll do, we'll go and have a look at the history of sinking funds and that around Australia at the moment. So in Queensland, it was originally introduced in 1987. This was looked at or coined by Leary and Partners. They were the first people to come into the industry to put together the sinking funds with that a lot of the legislation where that came about. You'll find there's a lot of this stuff in the retirement villages, stuff like that. So then it went into New South Wales in 2004 to 2006. Now this was introduced over a 3-year period because there was like 777,000 unit complexes in New South Wales. They thought this is going to be a bit difficult for us to implement this all in one hit, so they had that on a 3-stage approach. In the ACT, the sinking fund forecast was introduced in 2009, so that was a little bit later from the legislation from there. In Victoria, it was also brought in 2009, but only for units over $200,000 in turnover or 100 units in size. There's some trends now that the smaller units are now increasing, and they call it a maintenance plan in Victoria, and also in Tasmania's legislation it's done by the likes of the committee if they feel like doing one of those. So in WA, South Australia and Northern Territory, they call it a reserve fund forecast, and there's no legal requirements to have a forecast done in that period of time. So it's quite interesting to see on how this stuff all goes together with all the history of the sinking funds in Australia, and this is governed by the Strata Community Australia. Sinking Fund Management for Strata and Commercial Buildings, Part 2. Earlier on we looked at the sinking funds and the history of sinking funds and that in Australia. So what we'll look at will be a case study, and we'll go through what looks like in one of the reports and how that sort of goes together. So the problem with a lot of sinking funds, there's not enough money put aside for major items, and if you don't look after your building in the other states as opposed to some in Queensland, you're going to get yourself in a little bit of trouble. So the one we'll start off with is one that's in not really the best condition, and I'll go through that and let you know the way that we sort of try to manage that better for the client. Alrighty. So this is a set of 56 units. The building hasn't been maintained for 20 years. There's building cracking, there's painting repairs that need to be done. The complex was underinsured, it needs painting, pool needs attention, retaining walls are falling down, and you've got pipework issues. So they've got a fair bit of work that they need to do. Now, what you can see in these sinking funds, there's two critical areas in here in the management of the sinking fund forecast. One is looking at the elements of the building and how those elements make up the sinking fund forecast, and then the second part of it is that to look at these parts and go, how are we going to jumble these around? Alright, now you usually find that painting is in, say, a 10-year cycle, and you'll find there's as part of these three items, we're going to have a look here. So there's two painting cycles that are in this building, so we'll have a look to see where these main issues are. So you can see in here all the cracking and that from the gyprock, and so you've got water penetration in going through here. So the longer you leave this sort of stuff, then the more you're going to pay. So if we go and have a look here, you can see this is your first critical area of your sinking fund forecast, and then this is the second cycle. So at the moment now they've got not much money in the bank now, so what we had to do is trying to juggle these figures around here to make that nice and smooth so we don't have to hit them with a special levy first up. So what we're trying to do is minimise the impact to the body corporate or owners committee to make sure that everything sort of runs as smooth as possible. So you can see this is one part of the area that needs a bit of trouble. You've got a paved driveway, so you've got to put some money aside for the pavers in here. Now as your building gets older, you've got a heap of trees sitting around the countryside, so we need to have a look at that to put some money aside to look after those trees. Okay, so we're looking at driveway area, underground pipework. Now the gardens, most of that is administration fund for your day-to-day. Now if you're looking for a refurbishment on a large item, then that would be your sinking fund later down the track. So you've got painting to your main building in superstructure, you've got some money to put aside for your roof, you've got your downpipes down the side, and then from the common areas you've got common stairwells which need to be serviced and painted. So what we ended up doing was painting. Well, first of all we cleaned up got the building repairs, got that done in year 1. Then in year 2, then we painted the outside of the building, and then in year 3 we painted the inside stairwells because they can last a little bit longer. And that's why we sort of staged that over the first 3 years, because that's the biggest impact, and then we managed to bring the levies down to a bit more reality until they're back on track for their second part of the cycle. So that's one section that we can look at in that part 2. We'll go through one of the other reports. Sinking fund management for strata and commercial buildings. Earlier on in the last two series we were looking at the case study as well as the background behind the history of sinking funds in Australia. Now what we'll do, we'll go through one of the sample reports so you can see what is in one report and how these go together. So let's have a look here now. Alright, so this is one set of apartments, 1, 2, 3. So it's a 6-pack, it's been recently rented. We've got a little fence down the side and the driveway. So let's have a look at some of these parts inside of here. We'll make it a little bit smaller. Okay, so the forecast is going to go for 15 years. These are the parts of the sinking fund. So we're looking at where the property is, proposed levies, the methodology behind it, the annual balance of the sinking fund, and also the forecast of the cost and income of the bank balance over that 15-year period, and yearly expenditure of that table from there. So you've got a full plan over the 15 years so you know where you sit with everything in there. So we'll go on to the next page. Alright, so with the next page we're looking at this amount of units here. They've got no money in the sinking fund to start off with. There's 10 lot entitlements in the building, and the sinking fund's been set for $320 a year. So that should be enough money to put aside for the building to make sure that there's enough money to look after the building for that 15-year period. So we'll go to the next one and have a look there. Alright, so we're looking at the methodology in behind the sinking fund. So either with the sinking fund or a maintenance plan, we do that over a 15-year period. So this is where we talk about the levy incomes, where we allow for the levies over that time of period. We also allow for the interest period on how much money we need to set aside over that time, or the extra money that can be made available in the sinking fund forecast. Also with the report, you can either have it registered for GST or without GST to make that the easiest way to maintain your building, make sure that there's enough money put aside in the building to look after that program. Alright, so from here, so this is the forecast over the next 15 years. So we can see there was no money in the bank in the first year. Now there was 10 lots. So to maintain that building for over the 15 years, they're going to need to put aside $3,200 in the first year. And what we've done, we've allowed 5% inflation. So the levies will go up 5% a year to allow for that over that 15 period of time. And from that, we've got bank interest here at 2.5%. Okay, so then from the money they've got sitting in the bank, that can help reduce some of your levies over that period of time. So basically, here's your 15-year plan. Now, because that finishes at the end of the financial year, we do that from financial year end to financial year start. Here are our costs over the next 15 years, so they're all broken up into sections, which we can have a look a little bit later on. The money that we need to put aside to look after those costs for those 15 years. The interest that we can have from the bank account, so let the money work for the body corporate or the owners corporation. Opening balance at the end of the year, so you'll see you start off with no money. You've got $3,200 in year one. Now when you start your next year, it'll be $3,200. Okay. Now out of those 10 lot entitlements, we said $320 for year one, and you can see that's going to be your levies for the next 15 years. So $320 now, but in 15 years it'll be about $700 we need to put aside to see where the sinking fund will done from here. Now usually sinking funds get reviewed once every 5 years, so once we get over our first hump, then we'll probably do a review around year 5 to make sure that we can keep up with building costs and make sure that everything's right on track. So that's how that sort of goes together from there, but at least that way you've got a full plan, so you know this is where we're sitting now. We need to put some money aside for year 7, 8 and 9. Sinking Fund Reserve Management for Strata and Commercial Buildings. We're into part 4 of the video now, where we're explaining the sinking fund forecast or the maintenance plan report to see how much money we need to put aside to look after our strata or our commercial building. So this can be used in a lot of applications and not just in strata. So let's go back to the report to see where we're sitting at now. Okay, so we're talking about how much that we need to put aside for that 15-year period. So what we've done as well, we've put that in a graphical form as well. So there's 3 parts to the graph. One part is how much money that you've got in the bank, how much money we need to put aside, and the other part is where our expenses are. Okay, so this gives you a year-to-year update of where you need to sit in the sinking fund, or what are the expected expenses of the building over the year. Now you can see that everything has a cycle or has an effective life. Okay, so we can see in here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 major cycles in the sinking fund forecast. So that's where basically we're building up our funds as we get to a point, and as those expenditures come into play, then that drops down. Now usually we try to work out how much money we need to put aside as a minimum balance, so then this doesn't get too low when we run out of money from here. So this is the highest risk of the sinking fund forecast, to make sure we've got enough money to look after that building in that time. So to look after this building from here, this is the recommendations to put aside for the body corporate, to see what we need to how much money we need to put aside for the building. And we'll go on to our next slide now. Okay. So what we've done from here, we've cut this down into each section over each year. So you can take these sections out from here, put them into your administration budget. So we know that 2015 we've got external painting coming up, so repainting the soffites, our door faces, looking at the walls and ceilings in the stairwell. So that's that main thing in 2015. 2 years after that we've got 2017, so we're looking at the driveway, the fencing and the other items in there. Okay, so that gives you a good overview of those items that are coming up in that time, to make that a bit easier for you. Alright, so we keep going. So that does that for the whole 15 years, so that makes it a lot easier to work all that out. Okay, so what we've done as well, we've put that down into building areas. So we've broken the whole lot up. I might make it a little bit smaller so we can see that. Yep, that'll do. Alright, so we've looked at that over the other 2 areas. So this is where we put the effective lives in from here. Alright, so when we're looking at the building, so if we go back and have a look at the picture at the front. Okay, so we've got our painting on the outside, we've got a bit of driveway, we've got our soffites around here, we've got a stairwell, we've got garage doors that we'll need to maintain, and there'll be another fence that'll come in here. Alright, so this is the main picture, what we're looking at this building, what we need to maintain over that time. So we'll go back to where we were before. So we know there's our budget, that's fine. There's our graph to see where we sit. We've got our yearly expenditures. Okay, so this is some more of the nuts and bolts of that forecast. So we're looking at external facade, so that you're painting the outside, roofing, stairwell, driveway area, fencing, landscaping, fixtures and fittings. Okay, so if we were to do all those items now, that's $25,000 worth of those items. Okay, so we can see that each of these items have what they call an effective life. So we're looking at repainting the building. It'll cost you $3,000 now, but we're going to repaint that in 10 years time. So in 10 years that's going to be worth $7,000 to get that part of the building. Sinking Fund, Reserve Fund Management for Strata and Commercial Buildings. Part 5. So we've looked at a few items already before, so we've gone through the meaning of the sinking funds, how they go together, we've gone through some of the part of the report. Now we'll go back through the effective life of the building to work out the elements and how the sinking funds and that go together. Okay, so when we were looking at that building earlier on, we can see where we've cut them into the little sections to make that nice and easy. So we're going to say external facade, repainting the building. Now we've said it's got an effective life of 10 years, so we'll paint that in 10 years. So we're looking at repainting building and also balcony ceilings. So some balcony ceilings are owner's responsibility, but sometimes they're included in the overall of the body corporate. So one, they can get all painted at the same time, and also you can get the lowest possible price to get that painted at the same time. Okay, so that's the two high areas that we've got from there. And the soffits and the door face must be a little bit earlier on, so that's fine. And also the balustrading fittings. So to look after the balustrades, we've put some money aside in year 15. Okay, so we've got one cycle for the painting on the main outside, and we've got 2 cycles in here for the other part of the building. So depending on how the building ages, these may juggle around to work out how these go together and what we need to do. Okay, the roof. So we've got 4,500 looking after the roof, and we've got that in 7 years time. So we've got some money in year 10 and then year 7 after that, so that drops off the other end of the forecast. There's some money put aside there for some guttering. Now in the stairwell, we're looking at repainting the walls. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got that in year 5 and then year 10. Okay, so we've got two cycles in here in this part of the building, and we've got some money to put aside from some tiling by the look of it there. In the driveway area, there's only $800 put aside from there for driveway wash down to get rid of the grime that off the building, so off the driveway area. So that's to clean that down. It's not a replacement of the whole driveway, so it's just to maintain that in best condition. So depends, if you've got some sealing on the driveway, then you'd have to allow a bit extra in there. We've got a little bit of retaining wall in there, so we've got some money put aside for the boundary fencing, and also we've got some money for the retaining wall, but that's not till later in the forecast. So as you can see, over the next 15 years, we're pretty right for the next 5 years, so then we can look at something later on down the track. Alright, now let's go. So furniture, fixtures and fittings. So we're looking at main switchboard, to look after the main switchboard, where you might get some wires that'll start coming loose after a period of time. So that allows for your electrician to come in, check the board over, tighten up some of the wires, and make sure there's no hot spots in that amount of time. So it's just a small part of risk management to see how that goes together. Looking after your mailboxes and looking after your lighting as well. Okay, so that's one part sitting in here. There's also one element in there that is critical in here when we're looking at landscaping. Now as the building gets older, the problem you'll have is tree roots getting into the pipework, where you have to dig up the pipework and undo the block drain. So that's why we put some money in from here, and to look after the pathways. So this gives you a guide over the next 15 years to say, this is what we think may happen over the next 15 years. You can decide, say, oh, okay, we don't want to do the painting in this year, let's take that forward another 3 years, and we might do this whole section in this year here. But at least that way we can go back and have a look, see where our graph is, so we can say, okay, righto, we're not going to do our painting here, we'll pull it back here, we've got enough money to look after that building, and then that makes it a lot easier for you to manage your building.
We hope this short review was helpful. If you'd like to find out more, click the link below this video now.